Hi, my name is Mike Palmquist. I'm looking forward to talking to you about an approach I've been developing over the past few years for assessing and evaluating sources. I'll switch over to the slides and then talk with you more as we move through them. So let's start with some starting points. Those of you who may have seen some of my textbooks, like In Conversation or Joining the Conversation, know that I'm really interested in the conversation metaphor, which is the idea that we can build on students' extensive knowledge of conversation and help them become better writers by linking the knowledge they already have to the things we're trying to teach them as writers. It's basically the idea that we read other sources. In effect, we listen to the conversation. We reflect on the conversation through the reading we've done and through the observations we make in the world. We think about whether we want to actually throw our own voices into the conversation, and if so, we wonder about how. And it becomes a sort of circular process in which authors read widely, reflect on something, and make a contribution to the conversation, and then people pick up on their ideas. So for me, all of the assessment and evaluation work that I do is really deeply linked into this idea that you have to be aware of the sources, you have to read them widely, you have to get a real good sense of what's going on. So it works well. So in that sense, I think of evaluating sources as a critical writing and research skill. And for years, I've kind of taken the CRAP model, which I really think is a terrible acronym, but librarians seem to like it. Currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. I kind of changed it quite a bit, actually, to fit a more rhetorical approach towards evaluating sources. And it worked well for a long time. But as we all know, times have changed. So the question that I've come up with over the last few years is, what role does source-based writing play at a time when it's become increasingly difficult to discern distinctions among facts, alternative facts, and fake news? And as I look at that, the thing that I really think is important is thinking about information, misinformation, and disinformation, with misinformation being information that's simply incorrect, and disinformation being information that is intended to mislead or to lead you in the wrong directions. So when I think about what we need to consider, we really have to consider the biases and agendas of the authors and publishers that we're working with. We also need to consider the lure of new and exciting information. And this gets into social media in a pretty major way. These researchers, Vasogi Roy and Errol, reported in 2018 that they looked at a huge number of rumors that were circulating on Twitter for about a decade. And so they were able to track where these all went up. And their conclusion was pretty straightforward. False information spreads far more widely, with up to 100 times more people seeing tweets about rumors than about fact-based stories. And there's all kinds of reasons why this takes place. New and surprising information gets picked up because it resonates with us emotionally, or it resonates with some of our preconceived ideas, like, I always knew this was true, and things like that. So we really need to think about this as we're working with our students to help them understand that just because something looks really interesting doesn't mean it's necessarily true. The other thing we really need to consider is the impact of information bubbles. Some people call them echo chambers. There are other words for them, but the basic idea is that with all the news sources available to us, we tend to gravitate towards ones that align with our conceptions about what's appropriate, with our ideological positions, with our political positions. And so I talk to students about the importance of being really skeptical when they're looking at stuff that they always agree with. Why are they always agreeing with it? So I ask them to seek alternative perspectives and to consume news differently. Switch to channels that you don't necessarily watch. Go to different websites than you typically use. Look at different news sources. Search for things in different ways and try to find ways that you can take a look at this news and get better information. So as I've been working with all this, I started thinking, well, I'm still using this kind of CRAP model, and I don't much like it as much anymore, but it still works. It's still really important. It really is. It's consistent with a lot of the things we want to think about when we work from a rhetorical situation model. So I started thinking about a different way to go. And the approach I've come up with is based strongly in the conversation metaphor. It preserves a lot of the elements, actually some of the elements of the earlier approach. And it basically breaks down to a four-part process, which is, first of all, you want to take a look at a source and determine, does it is it relevant to the conversation, to the issue that's under discussion? Then you use this notion of lateral reading to assess credibility and fit, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. You want to read closely to evaluate the source, and this is where the CRAP model kind of approach comes in. And then you want to engage in rhetorical listening. And I've worked with a lot of these approaches before. They're well grounded in the way we think about things as teachers of writing. But putting them together in this way has been really helpful for me in my own classes. I've been teaching first-year composition, and I really enjoy working with those students. And we go through this in class, we work on it, and it seems to work extremely well. So I'll move on and we'll kind of walk through this, and then we'll wrap things up. So the first thing, assessing connections to your conversation, for me, it's all about relevance. I mean, what you really want to do is just take a look at a source and determine, on kind of a first look, skimming is really what we're talking about here. Does this match up? Is this something that I should spend more time with? And you know, when we search for results in a database or in a library catalog or on the web, we get a lot of hits. And so we take a look at those things and we start winnowing them down to the point where it's fairly useful. So first cut, does it look like it's relevant? If it looks like it's relevant, move on to the second step. And that's about reading laterally, this notion of reading to assess credibility and fit. And this is a concept that was developed by two Stanford researchers, Sam Weinberg and Sarah McGrew. I think Sarah McGrew was Sam Weinberg's graduate assistant. And they were looking basically at what fact checkers do when they're trying to assess the validity of a claim. So basically what you do is you examine how the information, ideas, and arguments in a source fits with the sources, with other sources that are addressing the same issue. They also call it lateral reading. A little bit, they're sort of nodding towards lateral thinking, but they're also literally talking about the fact that you keep opening new browser tabs if you're working within a browser. So the key moves they make is seeking information about the authors and publishers, following links in the source, conducting additional searches. So here's how it might work. So the first thing you do is, well, let's say we're interested in minimum wage and its impact on small businesses. So we go into our browser and we make an initial search. In this case, minimum wage, impact, small business. You get some results, you take a look at it, and eventually you open one of them up. It's a promising source. You start with, this one is minimum wage hikes and their consequences for small business. It's written by a guy named Ben Norman. It looks pretty good. So I've done the skimming part. I go, okay, this looks good. Let's take a look at this. Now I say, okay, who's Ben Norman? So I look for information about the author. I click on a link and it says, here it is, the author, Ben Norman, here's other work that he's done. That's one thing I look at. Second thing I do is I search for the author, Ben Norman, writer, and here's different Ben Normans that are out there. Eventually I find a link to his homepage and I view information about it. So here's something from the Arizona Chamber Foundation, which actually is the publisher for the article that I'm interested in. And it explains who he is. And then it gives me a link on this page to his own homepage. I go there, here's his brnorman.com, about him. Hi, I'm Ben. I view this information about the author. I go, well, he looks fairly credible. It's kind of interesting. And then I view information about the publisher. So now what I've done is I've searched for the topic that I'm interested in, something about the issue that I'm investigating. I've found a promising source. I've skimmed it and decided that I want to spend more time with it. I've looked at the information about the author. Now I'm looking about information about the publisher. And so here's the information about the chamber. I read that. And then I think, okay, well, let's just search for the title, the article title, to view reactions and republications. So far, I haven't found anything that's going to tell me this is an uncredible source. This is misinformation or disinformation. I mean, I might, on a much more careful read, I might find that there's some inconsistencies, but so far it's looking good. So the next thing I do is I take the article's title, I put it in the search bar, put quotation marks around it, and I search to see if there are other sources that have picked it up. We scroll down, we start to see if there are any, is there anybody out there who's saying that this article is not credible, not relevant, or it's using disinformation, or maybe they disagree with it, or they're supporting it, or whatever. And so I take a look at those sources. Next thing I want to do is I want to go back to the original article, and I want to follow links that are made in that article out to other places and see what kind of sources they're citing. In this case, they're sorting the Hill. The next thing I do is I see the second link in the article and I click on it, and I come to this site. So I look through it and check it out. So once you've completed this second step in the process, which is essentially what fact checkers do, you're just really trying to see, is this source that you've been looking at well situated in the conversation? Is it respected? Does it seem to be in line with what other people are doing? You're ready to move on to the third step, which is kind of using the old-fashioned crap model. Well, at this time, what you're doing is you're reading closely. You're actually going to go into the article. You're going to spend a lot more time with it. You're going to ask yourself questions like, is it relevant? Is the evidence that's provided useful? What more can you learn about the author and publisher? Is it timely? Does it matter if it's timely? Certainly with something like the minimum wage issues, timeliness does matter, but you might want to be looking at some historical information so that you can situate things. Is it a comprehensive source? At the beginning of a research process, you might be really interested in comprehensiveness because it gives you an overview of the topic. Later on, though, you might really not care about that at all, right? What about the genre? Is it an opinion piece? Is it, is it a blog? Is it a letter to the editor? Is it an editorial or a column of some sort? Is it a research report? What is it? How can you use this? Is it a video? So you can go through this whole process. And this is the kind of thing that I used to focus on entirely, but by putting these first two steps in front of it, you kind of can weed out a lot of sources before you get to the point and say, yeah, this is definitely a source I want to spend time with. And so the students really appreciate this. When you're done with this step, you're ready to move to the final step. And that's essentially engaging in rhetorical listening. The question that you want to ask yourself is, does what you've learned from the source suggest that you might want to change your position on the issue? I've always asked this question in my books, and I've always asked it in the classroom. It's like, you've learned something new. Does it change your preliminary position on the issue? Does it change your argument? Does it change your whole stance on what you're doing? Does it make you want to go to a new topic? But what is interesting to me is that it really aligns with the whole notion of rhetorical listening. And when you think about it that way, it really aligns well with some of the research and theory that's out there. So, for example, when you look at Wayne Booth's work or Krista Radcliffe's or Sonia Foss's or Cheryl Glenn's work, they're kind of collectively arguing that what you want to do is engage in conversation collaboratively, not aggressively. You want to say, what am I learning about this? It doesn't have to be an agree, disagree situation. And moving through this into this process and really taking the time to think, what has gone on here? What have I learned? Where does this leave me in terms of my understanding of this conversation, of this issue? It leaves you in a good spot. And I think that's one of the things we want our students to do. Essentially, we want them to reflect on what they've learned and move forward from it. So when you look at this whole process, it's basically just a simple 4-step process. It allows you to assess connections to your conversation, which is basically skimming. You want to read laterally. You want to act like a fact checker and just make sure you're dealing with something that's useful. You want to read closely to evaluate the source. And I particularly like doing that in the context of using rhetorical or criteria drawn from rhetorical situation. And then you want to engage in rhetorical listening. So thanks. I'll look forward to any questions, any comments, any observations you might have, and look forward to the rest of the session.